When people think about music, the natural tendency is to think about it as some sort of sound. That is, we typically think of music as a special subset of the entire world of sound possibilities. There's speech, there's animal sounds, there are other sounds of nature, there are mechanical sounds, and then there's music. However, a person can have a musical experience in the complete absence of sound. A classic everyday example is the so-called earworm, where you get a melody or tune or a part of a tune stuck in your mind, playing over and over and over again. You have a musical experience without any physical sound present. But that's not the only example. Imagining music in your head is also the purview of professional musicians, such as when a composer or a conductor imagines the sounds simply by looking at the notated score. In addition, people sometimes have musical dreams, and again, these take place in the absence of any actual physical sound. So music can happen even when there's no sound. In many cultures, there's no special term for music, and what we would think of as music making in these cultures is always accompanied by dance. Many ethnomusicologists today resist the temptation to talk about music as some sort of natural category, and instead habitually use the phrase music and dance. Music and dance rather than simply music. In this case, there's more to music than just sound. Some sort of body movement and often some sort of social engagement is a necessary part of the package. Bodily movement, social engagement, and sound are all packaged together in some cultures. Although musical experiences can happen apart from sound, as in the case when you have a tune stuck in your head, and although musical experiences can involve more than just the experience of sound, as in the case of music and dance, we're nevertheless justified in supposing that music has some sort of special relationship to sound. So it's not inappropriate to begin a psychological study of music by considering the nature of sound and how we experience sound. The physical presence of sound, or at least the mental imagery of sound, seems to be a common denominator. In saying this, I don't want to imply that bodily movement and social behavior aren't part of music. In later lectures, we'll focus in on both the role of bodily movement and social behavior in musical experience. But we'll start our discussion with sound. We'll find that our understanding of music will be enhanced by understanding a few facts about sound, a few facts about hearing, as well as more than a few facts about auditory perception. The first stage of perception is often referred to as sensation. Sensation typically focuses on the properties of the sense organs. In this lecture, we'll explore 5 general lessons about sensation. Let's consider our first general lesson related to sensation. Our senses are selective. A good illustration of this can be found in perception of color. Color ranges in wavelengths the full width of the electromagnetic radiation band, from radio waves way up to cosmic waves. But it turns out that all the colors, all of the millions of colors that we're able to see, are just simply combinations of 3 specific wavelengths that our eyes are sensitive to. If you look at the cones in the eye, we have a cone that we think of as the blue cone, which is tuned to the wavelength around about 440 nanometers. There's a green cone that's tuned around about 540 nanometers, and a red cone that's tuned about 580 nanometers. All those millions of marvelous colors that we see in the world are just simply combinations of mixtures of these 3 different wavelengths. We have no access to all the other millions of wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation that are available to us. We have a very restricted subset to just 3 that we see. So there are animals like snakes, for example, that can see in the infrared spectrum. It allows them to see a warm body, for example. They see heat, which we're unable to see. Well, the same thing can be seen in the case of hearing. The classic example here is that the range of hearing is typically described as between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz. That's a kind of idealization of human hearing. In fact, very few people are able to hear up to 20,000 hertz as adults. On the other hand, children are very much able to hear very much higher than that. So a child, a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old child, can often hear up to 40 or even 50,000 hertz. By the age of about 19 or 20, it's very unlikely you're hearing anything above about 15,000 hertz. Similarly, 20,000 hertz is a lower end. It seems like, well, between 20 and 0 there's not much there, but in fact there's a huge spectrum below 1 second, 1 hertz that goes right through to the Big Bang, if you want to think of it that way. But there are low frequencies that are not accessible to human hearing, and there are tons of high frequencies that are not accessible to human hearing. And there are other animals in the world, for example, bats that can hear very much higher than human beings, and elephants that can both produce and hear sounds that are very much lower than humans can hear. Sounds that are above normal human hearing we call ultrasounds, and sounds that are below human hearing we call infrasounds. So we could summarize this by saying that our senses allow us to glimpse only part of the information that exists in the world. Senses like hearing, vision, and taste give us only partial information. We never get the full story when we attend to the world. That's the end of our first lesson. Lesson number 2 is that our senses can deceive us. Classic examples of such deceptions can be found in various perceptual illusions, such as the Muller-Franz illusion. Here you're seeing a classic illusion. You can see that there's the long horizontal green line with these arrows pointing in different directions. And the important part of the illusion here is that those long horizontal green lines are in fact exactly the same length in each of these 3 illustrations. But most people would tend to think of the first line as being shorter and the last line as being longer, when in fact if you pull out a ruler and you measure them, you'll find that they're identical. So there's something about the visual system which is not allowing us to see the true length of these lines. Another good example of how our senses can deceive us is evident in something called color constancy. So in this illustration by Ed Adelson from MIT University, this is a computer-generated image, and I draw your attention here now to the checkerboard pattern, and in particular to the squares marked A and B. So although the A pattern, it looks like it's darker, and the B pattern looks like it's lighter, and it's very hard for us to look at those objectively, but in fact the A pattern, the color that's evident in the A square and the color that's evident in the B square are actually identical. Now, in this next illustration, we're going to connect up the A and B, and you can see that, in fact, especially if you block out the rest of the image, you'll see that, in fact, they're exactly the same shade of gray. But it's the presence of that green object, the green cylinder, which is casting a shadow. But our eye just simply wants to correct for this perception of the shadow, and so it doesn't actually allow us to see the colors, the true colors, as they are. Once again, the A and the B squares are identical. And part of what it means to be a good artist, often people will say that an artist needs to learn how to see according to what their eyes really tell them about the world, but in fact it's their eyes that's the problem. Our eyes tell us that A and B are different colors, but if you were trying to paint this image, you'd need to know that A and B are identically the same color of gray. So there's 2 examples I've given you of the ways in which our perception of the world can deceive us. Conclusion: the way we perceive the world is not a true reflection of what's actually out there. Our senses can deceive us so that what we think is the case is not actually the case. That's our second lesson. Our third lesson: sensation is utilitarian, not epistemological. Well, utilitarian, just a fancy word for useful. Epistemological is just a fancy word for knowledge-bearing, or ways in which the truth about the world, the truth or some true knowledge. So sensation is not intended to tell us the truth, it's intended to be useful to us. So we just saw an example of this in the case of color constancy. The reason why we see A and B as different, even though they're identical, is because it's useful for us to correct for the shadow cast by that green cylinder. And so, in effect, the deception that's taking place in our perception is intended to tell us something useful rather than to tell us the truth about the world. So this is an example. One of my favorite examples is from the work of Margie Prophet, who has studied the relationship between the transformation of taste that happens and the state of being a human being we call pregnancy. So you've heard probably all sorts of stories about how pregnant women end up having unusual tastes. So things that they would normally enjoy eating, when they're pregnant, they have this funny sensation that I just don't feel like eating that. They'll often have the experience of cooking up a meal, something that they think, oh, this is going to be delicious. But once it's finally sitting on their plate and they're smelling and looking at it, something doesn't feel right and they just don't want to eat it. And then there are these classic examples of women who want pickles and ice cream or some odd combination of tastes. So what's going on here? And in particular, why is it the case that a woman can eat a little bit of food, or in the case of morning sickness, it's very easy and very quick to purge. A woman might eat something, and then in no time, the next thing you know, it's gone. It's not in her stomach anymore. Why does this happen? Well, as they say, a pregnant woman is eating for two. And especially in the first trimester, when the fetus is very small, the fetus is very susceptible to natural poisons that occur in the environment. These are called teratogens. Now, for adults, these minute quantities of teratogens, these minute quantities of poisons, like small amounts of chromium and so on, that are not good for you in larger amounts, these can inhibit or they can be dangerous to a developing fetus. Now, literally what happens is the fetus commandeers parts of the brain of the pregnant woman that have to do with taste. And it becomes very conservative. So if there's the slightest possibility that there may be something off about that food, and the next thing you know, the woman is tossing her cookies, getting rid of that, because it may be dangerous to the developing fetus. So here it's kind of interesting, because a woman's sense of taste is literally taken over by the fetus, and what a woman thinks that she likes to eat, or what would normally be the case for her, all of a sudden it's as though she's not in control of her tastes anymore. Her tastes are not a reflection of her. In fact, they're a reflection of the fetus. So where a woman might think that this is going to be a great food, I'm going to really enjoy eating this is food I always love to eat, the fetus may have a different idea here. So it's not telling us the truth about the world. It's not telling us that this is bad to eat, but no, it's useful not to eat this. It's useful to be turned off and not to want to eat this at a particular point. My favorite example illustrating how sensation is utilitarian rather than epistemological comes from the work of Lee, Logan, and Pastor, an article published in 1991, where they studied walking sounds. People commonly are able to tell whether it's a man or a woman simply from the sound of the footsteps. And Lee, Logan, and Pastor got interested in this. What was it about the sound of footsteps that tells us that it's the sound of a man or a woman walking? The very first thing they did was to standardize the footwear. So they got rid of the high heels and any other kinds of indicators that might tell you that the footwear was intended for men or women. So they were wearing standardized footwear. But even when you do this, people are extraordinarily good at being able to tell whether it's the sound of a man or a woman walking. In their work, they actually nailed it. They were able to figure out very precisely what it is that allows us to tell whether it's the sound of a man or a woman walking. Now, you may not know this, but one of the secondary sex characteristics, one of the differences between men and women, is that men have disproportionately big feet. So men are just generally bigger, but in fact the size of the foot is even bigger once you've taken into account the difference in size between men and women. Men have big feet. Now it turns out that when you walk you make two sounds typically. So one is the sound of the heel making contact, and then the foot rotates, and then the slap of the sole happens a little later on. So you have heel contact, sole slap, heel contact, sole slap. And there's a time delay between the heel contact and sole slap, which turns out to be proportional to the size of the foot. In simple terms, the difference between men and women walking is that women walk kalip, 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 and men walk kalump, 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 kalump. They have a longer time delay between the heel contact and the sole slap relative to the gait of walking. Now, Logan and Pasteur were able to prove that this was the way in which people were deciphering whether it was a man or a woman walking by digitally editing these two sounds, so they could take the heel contact and sole slap and move them, by editing, move them closer together or move them further apart for a given gait. And as they moved them closer together on a femininity-masculinity scale, people would judge the sound as sounding more and more feminine, and as you move them further apart, they sounded more and more masculine. Now, let's just review the logic of what's going on here. So I might be hearing the sound of someone walking, and I might hear that there's a relatively long time delay between the heel contact and the sole slap, and therefore I infer that the size of the foot must be a rather large foot, and from that I infer that the person is likely to be large, and from that I make the conclusion that they're probably likely to be a man. That's basically how the brain is making the inference about judging the sex of a person on the basis of walking. There's only one problem here, and the problem has to do with people's judgments of foot size. It turns out that when we listen to people walking, we don't tend to hear, or it's not salient to us, what the foot size is. It's not as though we hear, oh, that's size 8, or that's a size 12. We're largely oblivious to the size of the foot, even though we're using the size of the foot to infer sex. The reason why is because brains are obsessed by sex. Sex is salient, sex is important, whereas foot size is not. So even though we're using foot size to judge sex, sex is what's salient, sex is what's important, sex is the utilitarian aspect of what it is that we're trying to draw out of these sounds. Now, no one for a minute thinks that any of this is innate, so no one thinks that somehow this is built into the brain. After all, on the African savanna, it's very difficult to hear footsteps. There's no linoleum floors or hardwood floors or concrete sidewalks or anything. So you tend not to hear these kinds of sounds. So clearly, because of the modern life situation, it's clearly something that we learn. We learn to associate the gender or sex of an individual with these sounds that tell us something about them. So the peculiar thing is that back to this issue of what it is that brains are interested in getting out of the world. So you've probably had the experience, you're walking down Main Street or High Street or something like that, and there are all these people that are walking by you, and you're largely oblivious to the fact that there's a little part of your brain that's constantly judging the sex of all of the individuals that you pass by. So you probably had the experience of walking down the street, and you might be with a friend or something like that, and then a person walks by, and you're sort of trying to avoid staring at them, and you kind of whisper to your friend, is that a man or a woman? Is that a man or a woman? And you kind of steal a glance, and you're trying to look, and you're not really sure, and so on. But all of a sudden you become obsessed by this individual. Is that a man or a woman? And now actually that whole process has been happening all the time. All the time that you've been walking down the street, there's this little part of your brain that's going, man, woman, man, woman, man, woman, man. What was that? And it's only when these things break, that is, the system is somehow unable to resolve whether it's a man or a woman, that the whole issue rises up to consciousness, and now you become aware of the fact that you've been making these judgments about whether a person is a man or a woman. So brains have their own agendas. They have their own things of what they're trying to draw out of sounds. And so we're not interested in foot size, but we are interested in things like sex and the way in which the brain gets wired and the kinds of information it pulls out of sensations relate to important things like food and sleep and sex and all of these other things that are important for survival. So the work of Logan and Pasteur is a very concrete illustration of the fact that sensation is utilitarian rather than epistemological. So we can summarize this by saying the purpose of a perceptual system is not to provide an accurate mental representation of the world. The purpose of a perceptual system is to increase the adaptive fitness of an organism by providing a useful mental interpretation of the world. Or if we wanted to summarize this, the goal of perception is utilitarian, not epistemological. So that brings us to the end of this lesson, and now we can move on to our fourth lesson. Sensations are emotionally colored. Some of you may recognize this fruit. It's called a durian. Durians grow and are consumed in Southeast Asia, places like Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia. They're very popular amongst some people, but not everyone. Most of you probably will have never tasted this. All reports indicate that it has a wonderful, beautiful taste, and it's very nutritious fruit. There's only one problem, and the problem has to do with the smell. So, as travel writer Richard Sterling wrote, its odor is best described as pig doo-doo, turpentine, and onions garnished with a gym sock. Most people have, in fact, even in Southeast Asia, places like hotels and restaurants, they're largely banned. You can't even, in Singapore, for example, they're forbidden on the subway system. They are really very aromatic and they're quite memorable. Nevertheless, the fruit is nutritious and tasty, and so you have to ask the question, who cares about the smell? Why should the smell have any kind of function here if we just think in terms of nutrition and taste? Well, notice that what happens is as we go into the world, our own noses, our own taste buds, our own eyes, our own ears have their own agendas about what they think is a good thing and what they think is a bad thing. And so a fruit that smells like a toilet is not a fruit that you're going to find very appealing. Well, another example, in fact, my favorite example of this phenomena has to do with what's called the Capgras syndrome. It's spelled Capgras with an S, but it's actually a French name, it's a French word. Comes from Jean-Joseph Marie Capgras, who was a psychiatrist who described the first known instance of Capgras syndrome, I believe in 1923. Now, Capgras syndrome is a very unusual syndrome. It typically arises because of some sort of brain injury. It might be some sort of head trauma. It could be a stroke that leads to it, or it could be a tumor. There are various ways in which you could have the Capgras syndrome. Now, what's the presenting syndrome? What's the presenting symptom of Capgras syndrome? Well, the presenting symptom is denial of loved ones. Denial of loved ones. So imagine you were in the hospital and you'd had this brain trauma of some sort, and you're coming out of your situation and you're lucid, and now you're entertaining visitors and so on, and then your mom comes to visit you, and then later on the doctor drops by their bedside and says, "Well, I noticed earlier that your mom came to visit you. She wasn't my mom. She looks a lot like my mom. She seems to know an awful lot about me, but she's not my mom." She's not your mom? So this is the classic presenting syndrome, is that people who would normally be people that you would love or have close affection for, you come to believe that they're imposters. So your husband or your wife, your children, you will think these are imposters. I mean, you might be polite to them and so on, and they look exactly like your children and they have all of, but no, somebody switched them. They're not the real thing. Even your pet dog or your pet cat, if they bring that to your bedside, you'll come to the conclusion that it's an imposter. It's not really foo-foo. So now, notice an interesting thing about this is that this doesn't happen for people who don't have the same kind of relationship in your life. So let's say some friends from work come to visit you. Charlie and Jill come from work, and later on the doctor says, "Well, I see some of your friends from work came, your colleagues came." "Oh yeah, Charlie and Jill came." "Oh, well, they were imposters?" No, that was Charlie and Jane," and so on. It's only people who have a strong emotional attachment to you that you will consider to be imposters. Now, the good thing about Capgras syndrome is typically after between 3 and 6 months, it typically goes away. Sometimes it takes longer than that. But so there's usually an end to that. There's a good news at the end of the rainbow, but it can be awfully disconcerting for the people involved to begin with. Why does this happen? What's the basis of Capgras syndrome? So what we know is that the back of your brain, the so-called occipital cortex, which is involved in visual recognition, including things like facial recognition. So typically what happens is that that's connected to part of the limbic system, which is involved in emotions. And so when I see my mother, the occipital lobe that lights up and says, "I recognize mom." And then there are projections that come from the occipital lobe into the limbic system, which now emotionally color that experience. So the occipital lobe is saying, Mom, but the limbic system is saying, Mom, and it's coloring this experience with emotion. What is suspected to be the case in Capgras syndrome is it's a disconnect syndrome in which the projections from the occipital lobe to the limbic system are broken. And now what that means is that the occipital lobe says, Mom, without emotion, and the limbic system is just sitting there. It's just like a lump on a log. There's nothing there. So there's a part of you that looks and says, Mom, but there's no emotion, not the slightest bit of emotion. So you're left in this quandary. How is this possible? This can't be Mom. She must be an imposter because I feel nothing. The same thing with all of the other elements in your life that you would love or that you would normally feel strong emotion for. Even something like a pair of shoes, your favorite pair of shoes. So whenever you see them, you always feel that warm, fuzzy feeling about that wonderful pair of shoes. In this case, in Capgras syndrome, you'll even think that somebody has switched them. They're not really that's not my pair of shoes. Why? Because it's the lack of emotional color, the absence of emotional color, that causes you now to confabulate and make up a story about why it is that you could experience this without feeling any emotion. What this points to is that in our normal lives, when we're experiencing things, there are frequently, in fact often, most of the time, there are these emotional components that are coming along for the sensual or perceptual experience. And when they're absent, we take notice. We end up with things like Capgras syndrome. So, by way of summary, there is nothing in the real world that is objectively ugly or objectively beautiful. It is we who project these qualities onto the objects and phenomena, and our perceptual systems have their own ideas about what's attractive and what's repulsive. They color our perceptions so that we can't objectively experience something without any emotional investment. Let's move on to the last of our 5 general lessons regarding sensation. Stimuli are not what they evoke. So, Plato famously wrote about a cave. It's usually referred to in the literature as Plato's cave. And he had this idea of, imagine if you were sort of somehow chained down. You were living in a cave, and you were chained in such a way that you were facing the wall of the cave, and behind you was a fire, and the flickering light would cast shadows, and all you had ever seen in your entire life were the shadows that were being projected onto the walls. You'd never seen actual people or fire, for that matter, any of these other things. All you'd ever seen in the world were shadows. And Plato understood that this is, in a sense, the nature of all perception. We never get an opportunity to see things for what they truly are. What we're seeing are symptoms. We're seeing little bits of information, little shreds and pieces of evidence from which we construct the world. A person who was chained down in that situation, looking at the shadows on the wall, we could very well imagine that they would believe that the shadows are the actual object, and that they had never been allowed to turn around and look behind them and see what was actually causing the shadow. So the allegory here is that we can be viewing shadows and thinking that the shadows are the real thing when they're not. They're merely pieces of information. Of this, we make a distinction between 2 philosophies, philosophical idealism and philosophical realism. You might think by the word idealism that we mean someone who's idealistic. That's not what philosophical idealism means. In philosophical idealism is the belief that what we're actually experiencing, there aren't real objects in the world. The external world is merely an imaginary figment of our imagination. It's a projection of what we're thinking rather than real objects in the world. By contrast, philosophical realism or philosophical realists are people who believe that there really are objects in the world, there really are things that exist, and what I'm doing is apprehending them in a certain way. So what we know is that the perceptions we have of the world are being reenacted in a mental space where we're creating these representations of what's going on, and ultimately we don't really have access to the real world. So we don't really know whether the real world exists or not, and when you think about it, whether you're a philosophical idealist or philosophical realist, it might tell you something a bit about a person's beliefs, but ultimately it doesn't tell you anything meaningful about how they might apprehend the world differently. If you doubt this, I recommend a classic movie called The Matrix. Everyone should watch this movie because it's a very apt and very wonderful portrayal, essentially a portrayal of what the experience of idealism would be, where your body is, in a sense, it's almost as though it doesn't matter whether you have a body. It's projected into this ideal space, and you live in a world of, in a sense, all of these shadows, where the appearance becomes the reality. So the fifth lesson, then, is that our senses allow us to glimpse only part of the information that exists in the world. Senses like hearing, vision, and taste give us only partial information. We never get the full story when we attend to the world. Well, this brings us to the end of our introduction on sensation. Let's summarize what we've learned. We've discussed 5 general lessons about sensation. First, our senses are selective. Although you might think of our senses as windows onto the world, in reality, these windows are rather narrow. What we experience of the world is really quite restricted. Second, our senses can deceive us. There are lots of perceptual illusions. We can see a color, judge the length of a line, or hear a musical pitch, and be completely at odds with reality. Third, sensation is utilitarian, not epistemological. The purpose of perception is not to tell the truth. Our senses don't exist in order for us to know the world. Instead, our senses are there to help us survive and procreate. Accordingly, our senses sometimes exaggerate certain aspects of the world, and in other cases, hide things from us. Fourth, sensations are emotionally colored. We look into a dark cave and we see gloom. We look at a desert expanse and see desolation and loneliness. We listen to birds twittering in the trees and can hear the cuteness and joy. But the gloom, the loneliness, the cuteness, the joy, these are all things that we have brought to these sensations. These emotional flavors are not present in the outside world. They're not part of the sights and sounds themselves. Finally, there's our fifth lesson. Stimuli are not what they evoke. We need to make a distinction between the tree out there and the tree in here. The tree out there evokes the tree in here. Obviously, there's a relationship between the external world and how we mentally represent these things. But it's not a one-to-one correspondence. Some of the most interesting aspects of perception have to do with how the subjective mental image we have of the world differs from the objective reality. We'll learn much more if we're careful about how to describe things. We need to be clear about whether we're talking about what's out there or what's in here. In the world of sound perception, we use the word acoustical to refer to physical phenomena in the world, and the word auditory to refer to what's evoked in the mind. Music, we'll discover, is an auditory phenomenon, not an acoustical one.